Hi, I'm Anna Denton-Jones and today I'm going to be explaining a little bit about payment in lieu of notice. Before we talk about payment in lieu of notice, let's just think about notice in general. Hopefully you've got a contract of employment which sets out in writing what the employee might be entitled to expect from you if you were to bring their employment to an end. For example, it might refer to them being entitled to 1 month's notice. There is a statutory provision that sits alongside this that we need to think about that grants the employee 1 week's notice for every year served up to a maximum of 12 weeks. So, for example, if your employee had been with you for 6 years when you brought their employment to an end, they would actually be entitled to 6 weeks' notice and not the 1 month provision that you've got written down. So, it is worth thinking about both of those issues before we think about payment in lieu of notice. So what is a payment in lieu of notice? Well, as the name suggests, really, instead of requiring the employee to work out their notice period in return for their salary and benefits, it's a concept by which you can bring the employment to an end sooner rather than later in return for a payment of a lump sum equivalent to those same salary and benefits that the employee would have got if they had worked out their notice period. Why might you want to do this? Well, the main reason for me in relation to making a payment in lieu of notice is the disengagement of the employee. Once you've told them that you no longer want them to work for you or vice versa, they may well be disruptive to their colleagues, they might not be particularly productive, they could even be downright dangerous and damaging to your business, so things like customer relationships. Or I've even known employees do damage to employers' computer systems before they leave. The other key thing to think about is the relationship between this idea of payment in lieu of notice and restrictive covenants in the contract of employment. Restrictive covenants are provisions which restrict what the employee can do after they've left your employment. So in return for you having paid them, etc., they've agreed that they will not poach your customers or your staff or set up in competition with you, those sorts of things. The important thing there is that if you do want to preserve those provisions for the long term, you need to make sure that if you make a payment in lieu of notice, you're doing so in circumstances where you've got the contractual right to do so. This is because if you don't put something in the contract about it, technically making a payment in lieu of notice will be a breach of contract, even though the employee has had the same payment that they would have otherwise have got, and your covenants will fall away. So it's very important, if you want to rely on your covenants, that you do have something in the contract of employment in relation to payment in lieu of notice. The other issue for employers to think about in relation to termination payments is tax. Now, if you've got a payment in lieu of notice clause in your contract of employment, then any payments that are made upon the termination of employment that equate to notice pay and benefits will be taxable. National insurance will be payable on it. There are circumstances where employers prefer to not say anything in the contract of employment in an attempt to leave it open to them at a later stage to argue that certain payments may be made tax-free. So that is another area to consider. I want to make a distinction between payment in lieu of notice and just waiving notice. So there are circumstances where an employee may say to you, I know I've got to give you 2 months' notice, but I'd like to go sooner rather than later. Please, will you allow me to go straight away? If that's the case and you're actually waiving notice and bringing the employment to an end sooner, then obviously less pay will attach to that because we're not actually making a payment in lieu of notice, we're actually waiving the notice period. If you are making a payment in lieu of notice, you need to make it really clear that that's what you're doing in writing. So setting out in letters that your employment's ending today, we are going to make a payment in lieu of notice, the payment's going to be processed on Friday when payroll is run, that sort of thing. The reason why that's important is that the Employment Tribunal, when deciding things like the effective date of termination for concepts such as unfair dismissal and whether or not the employee's got sufficient service to bring a claim, will look at when was the date of termination of the employment. That's why it's critical to make sure you've said it in writing. I hope that's clarified a little bit more for you around payment in lieu of notice, and I look forward to seeing you again.